Hey, podcast listeners, Caleb here. Just a quick word about this episode, and that is, it is set in postbellum America. In other words, after slavery and the Civil War. So while this episode isn't about slavery per se, the events we discuss happened in the immediate aftermath of slavery. And it goes without saying that slavery, the antebellum era, and the postbellum era can be difficult topics to discuss and hear about. And that's putting it mildly. Anyway, that's all we wanted you to know. Here's the show.
If you'd like to earn CPE credit for listening to this episode, visit earmarkcpe.com. Download the app, take a short quiz, and get your CPE certificate. Continuing education has never been so easy. And now, on to the episode.
This is Oh My Fraud, a true crime podcast where the criminal masterminds are undone because they made a typo on an invoice or decided to take a long weekend. I'm Caleb Newquist.
And I'm Greg Kyte, back from a long weekend.
Was it a nice long weekend, Greg?
It was. Well, you know, the Christmas holidays had some days off.
Right.
Yeah.
This is our first show of 2024. So I guess Happy New Year's in order.
Yeah, Happy New Year. Let's make sure that for our first episode of the new year, we just pick a very serious topic for our yuck show about fraud.
About fraud?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, should we read a review?
Yeah.
I know you like it.
Let's do it.
I know you like it.
I love listening. Is this a 1-star or a 5-star?
This is a 5-star.
Ooh, nice.
It's 5-star. Yeah.
Nice.
And this comes from Stars and Reviews on Apple Podcasts, and they write, quote, "Fun and interesting. I love listening to this podcast. It quickly became my go-to podcast, beating out the true crime ones. I'm still working toward my CPA and in the phase of getting those extra 30 college credits. This podcast has saved me when I have nothing left to say on the umpteenth discussion board post of the day. I rehash something I learned on the podcast, loosely tie it back to the classwork, and then tell all my classmates to listen to Oh My Fraud. Works every time." End of quote. That is that's a okay review, wouldn't you say, Greg?
I'd say that's a great review, but also I just want to check with you to make sure it's not just me. But are they saying that they use the content from our fraud podcast to cheat on their homework? It kind of sounds like they're using a fraud podcast to commit fraud in their discussion board homework.
I'm not. I don't feel comfortable speculating, but since you pointed out, I kind of want it to be
that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Gotcha. Well, regardless, I do dig it whenever people tell their classmates or coworkers or friends or family members to listen to the show. So thanks, Stars and Reviews, for getting the word out. Also, listeners, just wanted to make sure you knew that Caleb and we do speaking engagements. So if your firm wants us to do some in-house training, and it will be clean in-house training, we're pros. We know how to turn it on and shut it off. Or if you want us to give a keynote presentation on ethics or fraud at your conference, just send us an email at ohmyfraud@earmarkcpe.com to get more information about pricing and availability. And like I said, we do that stuff clean. As a matter of fact, if you want us to swear at your fucking event, it's going to cost more. It's a goddamn upcharge.
Yeah, you got to pay a premium for the fucking swears.
You goddamn right you do.
Yeah. So, Greg, I have a question.
Yes.
Are you a history buff?
Oh, Caleb, I am categorically not a history buff. No, I mean, listen, the only History Channel show that I've ever watched is Pawn Stars, and I'm pretty sure it's light on historical content. I'm just gonna say,
is that really on the History Channel? I don't have cable anymore, so I don't even know.
Yeah, no, that's one of the big shows on the History Channel, and which is why that's the one that I've watched. But I have to say, I mean, history buff. I'm not like anti-history, because that's not a thing to be anti.
Is it not? That'd be a weird thing to be against.
I don't think that you're going to find anybody that says, you know what I hate is the past. So. Or even hearing about it
here,
right? I don't. And again, because I think because you asked if I was a history buff.
Yeah.
Do I enjoy history? Sure. One of my top items that I asked for on my Christmas list just this past Christmas was a book on the history of Hawaii. So I will delve into it, but I can't say that I'm a history buff. I'm curious about stuff, and I love a good story, and history has a lot of good stories. I'm not trying to give too much away, but I'm pretty sure history is nothing but stories. So, right? So I like a good story.
Yeah.
Historical or otherwise. So, yeah.
Today's episode is a story from a time in U.S. history that was a time of progress and rapid change, but also fraught with violence, civil unrest, racism, and even a disputed presidential election. And no, I am not talking about present day. I kind of gave that away in the opening, I suppose.
Right. But it is kind of spooky how much everything you said could be applied to like right now.
It's all very cyclical.
Yeah.
This story is from a long time ago, but not that long ago when you think about it. Today's story is from the Reconstruction era.
Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president of the United States, POTUS if you like, issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st of 1863. And what did that do? I'll tell you what it did. It changed the legal status of more than 3.5 million enslaved African Americans in the Confederate state from slave to free. And just for clarity, Abraham Lincoln had been killing vampires for over 25 years at this point. And like I said, I'm not a history buff, but I watched the 2012 documentary Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, so I'm not an idiot. Anyway, this was the middle of the American Civil War, mind you, and so it's not as though slave owners throughout the Confederacy were all like, oh, Abe said to let these guys go free. Okay, hey, everybody, get out of here. No, the Confederacy obviously was fighting the Civil War because they wanted to keep slavery, but what the Emancipation Proclamation did was it allowed any escaped slave that made it to the Union states to be permanently free. The states in the rebellion obviously weren't going to abide by that, so the actual literal end of slavery was more of a process rather than just a single moment in time.
Yeah, so Greg, I don't know. This seems obvious. Like when in the course of doing the research for the show, this became obvious to me, like, oh yes, I knew that. It wasn't like, today's the day, like slavery ended. It was definitely like a series of things that had to like wind it all up. But I think in our cultural imagination, like our collective cultural imagination, I think a lot of people just have to think, oh yeah, one day it was just over. Like,
right.
I just don't know how well people understand how long and what it took for slavery to like be kind of eradicated in the country. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. Well, speaking from personal experience, the whole idea of Juneteenth, which is now a federal holiday, was something that I didn't even know was a thing till just the last few years. Because for me, like you're saying, I think when all this stuff was presented in school, they're like, yeah, so there was the Civil War, Lincoln gave the Emancipation Proclamation, slaves are free. Let's talk about Reconstruction.
And then the North defeated the South, and everything was fine.
But that's the thing. I think even that's blurred up, where it's almost like I think in my mind, the Emancipation Proclamation. I don't think I realized that was mid Civil War,
right?
And which again, like you said, obviously, with that being the case, there's a whole lot that needs to kind of fall in line before this. Even though freedom was proclaimed, when freedom was actually enjoyed by those who were freed.
Right.
But speaking of Juneteenth, which just became a federal holiday recently, that's the holiday where we celebrate the commemoration of the end of slavery, which was June 19th of 1865. That was the day that Major General Gordon Granger ordered the final enforcement of the Emancipation Proclamation in Texas. But also, another layer to the whole emancipation story was the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the amendment that abolished slavery except as a punishment for crime. That took quite a bit of time also. The 13th Amendment was first passed by the Senate in April of 1864, but then it didn't pass the House of Representatives until 9 months later, and then it was finally ratified at the end of 1865, which means that took a full 18 months more than that, 20 months for this thing to go from the beginning to ratification. So again, this is a process that we're talking about. And all that was nearly 3 years after Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and over 8 months after he was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth.
With the end of slavery in 1865, the Reconstruction era had begun. This marked the period of time after the Civil War where America had to rebuild and reunify the nation. This included rebuilding its infrastructure. There had been a pretty big war, after all.
Right. There's probably some damage to some infrastructure.
Yes. Plenty of fire, as I recall.
Yeah.
Reintegrating the southern states into the Union and addressing the social, political, and economic impacts of slavery in American government and institutions. Now, that last bit, specifically the economic impacts of slavery, that is where our story lies today. And when you think about it, 3.5 to 4 million people who had virtually no rights now had the freedom to do anything, to do whatever they could. But where would you even start, right? Like that's kind of a, one minute you're property of someone else, and the next minute you have to fend for yourself.
Right.
That's a very, I don't know. Obviously, freedom is better than not. Okay,
right.
Let's state that out at the outset. Like freedom is better than not. But you all of a sudden, all of these people are navigating the world in a completely new way.
Right.
And I think that is incredibly hard to kind of imagine, like what that must have been like. And that's what these emancipated people had to do, is like they had to figure out how to live in the world.
Yeah. I mean, again, and this is probably a very simple, oversimplified way to think of it, but the way that my brain makes sense of it is that the slaves who were emancipated, they were given theoretical freedom. It's like, because
right.
Like you said, when you're saying they had the freedom to do whatever they wanted, it's like, no, they didn't though.
Right.
But,
true.
So it was theoretical, but just like anything else, like here's the theory and here's how it works in real life. And I think that's what you're talking about, is it's like, okay, now things have completely changed for you in theory, but there's so much that you haven't experienced before, so much that wasn't available to you. There's a huge learning curve that has to be figured out. And there's stuff that just is only theory and not in reality.
Right.
To the freedom that those people were experiencing.
Right. So for example, they virtually had no economic resources or capital.
Right.
Right. And so like the options that were made available to them, like for example, sharecropping, not great.
Nope.
Right.
Yeah. Pretty. But, I mean, so, some of the way, and again, my limited, not a history buff, but my understanding of sharecropping is it was kind of like, it was almost like, let's try to reinstitute slavery to some extent.
Right.
So,
essentially, but they had, but by virtue of the law, they had to give them something.
Right.
But it wasn't much.
Yeah.
But still, but that small amount of it was still money.
Yeah.
And then also African Americans that served in the Union Army, they earned wages serving in the Army. So they put, the ones that served in the Army, they would put those wages in military savings banks.
Okay.
Yeah. And it was those military savings banks that inspired a guy by the name of John W. Alvord. I think it's Alvord. Alvord?
Yeah, that's how
that's what it looks like. Yeah. He was a congregational minister, and he established the Freedmen's Savings Bank to help alleviate some of this socioeconomic stress. Okay.
Because, and again, tell me if I'm wrong, but because you did the bulk of the research for this episode. My understanding is that there just wasn't a place for freed slaves to deposit their money.
Right. So I don't know. I think, well, what happened was Congress established this thing called the Freedmen's Bureau. Okay. And the Freedmen's Bureau did all kinds. And again, I'm not a historian, but like in the research that I did, the Freedmen's Bureau did a ton of different things, including like establishing schools and establishing resources and services for all these emancipated people. And one of the other things that they did when they established the Freedmen's Bureau is they also incorporated the Freedmen Savings Bank, which was also known as the Freedmen Savings and Trust Company. Okay. So they did establish this bank as a part of the Freedmen's Bureau. And there's a whole, like I said, there was all kinds of different stuff that was instituted through this Freedmen's Bureau.
Right.
And it was, oh yeah, go ahead.
Well, it just, I mean, again, thinking back to just how shitty everything was back then for the freed slaves, and I mean, like I'm torn between two things to go. Well, that's cool that somebody was at least honest, going, hey, there's services that the freed slaves need that aren't being given to them, even though they're now freed people and should have access to them. But then also, I've got to assume that it's just because, like we said at the beginning, even though the slaves were freed, people were still being plenty shitty to the freed slaves.
Oh yeah.
So
of course.
So like I said, feeling very conflicted about this, where it's like, well, that's nice. That's a good thing that this was set up, but then it's like it's a bad thing that this had to be set up.
Right.
If that makes
like,
sense.
because there was plenty of conventional banks just around.
Yeah.
And there were and there were schools, and there were places for them to work, and all those kinds of things. But like you say, with the era of Reconstruction, like it's not like it's kind of like what we talked about earlier. It's like it's not like slavery ended in one moment where somebody like they threw their arm down. It's like it's done. It's
right.
And so same thing with in the post-slavery world. It's like it's not like racism just stopped in one fell swoop. It's like okay, everything is fine now.
Exactly.
No, like there was all kinds of things at work to work against to continue to marginalize the emancipated slaves. Right. So yeah, the Freedmen's Bureau was something that was something that the government did, that the federal government did.
Right. And that's the tragedy of this, just to make sure that it's clear where we're coming from. Also, is by no means is what you just said, us saying, oh yeah, but racism solved now. So because which is weird that even has to be said, because there are prominent politicians right now who are making that case. It's like, yeah, racism's done. And and for the two podcast hosts of this show, you and me, we're definitely not arguing that by any stretch.
No. Anyway, Freedmen's Savings Bank was to provide banking services, specifically taking deposits through its branches for the newly emancipated people in communities across the nation. Freedmen's Bank opened for business on April 4th, 1865 in New York City.
Freedmen's Bank quickly became a success. Within just a few years, the bank had 19 branches and 23,000 depositors, virtually all of whom were Black Americans. Churches and other institutions such as Howard University, which was established in 1867, had accounts with Freedmen's Bank as well. Ultimately, 37 branches were established and over 100,000 people opened accounts with Freedmen's Bank. According to a history of Freedmen's Bank, on the U.S. Treasury Department website, most of the deposits at the bank were small, less than $60, but keep in mind, $60 way back then is equivalent to about $1,200 today. Oh. So small, but not tiny.
Right.
Because, I mean, how many times have you heard recently that whole thing that, 60% of American households can't handle a $400 emergency payment.
expense. So, yeah. Right.
So again, it wasn't. It sounds like nothing, but if you adjust for inflation, it was still not humongous deposits, but not immaterial also.
Right.
Here's a quote from the U.S. Treasury Department website. It says, people could open an account with as little as 5 cents and accounts with at least $1 earned interest. People would often put their money in the bank during the summer and autumn and take it out in the winter and spring when their supplies would be running low. People also used their savings to buy bigger items such as homes, land, farm animals, and tools.
So it sounds to me, if I may stop you, it sounds to me like it is doing what they wanted it to do.
Sounds like a bank working like a bank.
Working like a bank, right?
Yeah. You put your money in there to make sure it's safe and take it out when you need it.
Yep.
Like banks do. So also by 1874, nearly half of the bank's employees were African American. Most were cashiers, which at that time, cashier was actually the top official at a branch, interestingly enough. As for Freedman's bank's governance, it was similar to many conventional banks in that all of its original trustees were white men. In this case, there were 50 of them, 50 white dudes running the bank. So not a lot has changed in 150 years.
I was gonna say, feels
probably
pretty close.
Bancorp is very similar in their boardroom today.
Oh man, we're gonna hear from some from some banking trade groups. It's like, I'll have you know. Yeah, we'll hear from some banking trade groups. The American Bankers Association will be up our ass.
Right. One big way that Freedman's bank governance was a little different from other banks, its charter said that it would be allowed to invest the deposits in, quote, stocks, bonds, treasury notes, or other securities of the United States, but it was forbidden from making loans. So, yeah, it was a bank working like a bank but just not in the one way that all of us think of banks working as bank. It was just off by one offering.
Yeah. Which was, I think, I don't recall this being made explicitly clear in the research, but they really just did want to focus on taking deposits.
Right.
And that, I don't know, there were some concerns about, loans that, they maybe their heads were in the right place about not wanting to offer loans, but as you're about to tell us,
yeah,
it didn't last long.
Yeah. But the prohibition on loans didn't last very long. In 1867, Freedman's Bank moved its headquarters from New York City to Washington, D.C., and new trustees were quickly installed. In 1868, trustees including John Alvord, who we already mentioned, and Henry D. Cook, the head of the bank's finance committee, started pressuring Congress to amend the bank's charter to allow them to make loans. And they got their wish. A couple years later, Congress passed an amendment to the bank's charter in 1870, and from then on, Freedman's Bank could make them loans.
Despite its early success, there was some activity happening at Freedman's Bank that was definitely not in the best interest of its depositors. A lot of the stuff that we found for this episode comes from a book published in 1976, written by a historian by the name of Carl Osthaus, who I tried to contact, actually. I was surprised to find that he's a professor emeritus at Oakland University.
Okay.
And I wrote him a very nice email, but since he's an emeritus, maybe he doesn't check his email very often.
Maybe not.
But in any case,
maybe not every day.
Yeah. Anyway, he wrote a book entitled Freedmen, Philanthropy, and Fraud, A History of the Freedmen Savings Bank. And that's where a lot of these details come from. For example, the book describes how trustees were not required to give, quote, any security for the faithful discharge of their trust, end of quote. Many trustees had little to no involvement with the bank, some even denying that they had agreed to join the board.
Okay.
And the charter...
That strikes me as very weird.
Yeah. And the charter lacked any penal clauses to hold trustees personally liable for bank solvency. Now, one thing that's, I think in kind of contemporary business, everybody knows that a board of directors is ultimately where the buck stops with a business, right? Especially when you think about big business, right?
Yeah.
People think, oh, the CEO is the person in charge. And like, the CEO works at the pleasure of the board. Okay.
Right.
So like, the board is really where, that is the group of people who run and govern a business, a corporation, if you like.
Yep.
In this case, it is very strange to me. And oh, by the way, and that board, they are liable for their decisions should things go terribly, terribly wrong. Like boards of directors get sued all the time,
right?
For doing things that people don't like. Anyway,
right.
It is very strange to me that these trustees virtually had no liability.
Yeah. No exposure for bad decisions
in running this bank. So, red flag.
Yeah.
Probably even in the 1860s, that would have been a red flag.
You'd think so.
Maybe. I don't know. Again, Greg and I aren't historians. But in any case, there was also evidence that the bank's management misled depositors about a supposed government guarantee, interest payments, and the use of deposit funds. Quote, during its initial years, the bank marketed itself widely to attract deposits, distributing bank pamphlets at churches and Freedmen's Bureau schools, advertising in local newspapers, and holding public meetings at churches, beneficial societies, and the bank's branches. Its advertisements often depicted the bank as having the backing and guarantee of the federal government, but as a private corporation, it had no guarantee. For example, an article in the semi-weekly Louisianan stated, quote, there is no possibility for loss, for the reason that the government of the United States is responsible for every dollar deposited. The bank promised its depositors 6% interest, but often paid a lower rate.
I hate that
Not good.
much.
That is bad banking, Greg. That is bad banking.
Well, and it's one of those things where you'd go, I mean, so many times when we talk about stories of fraud, you have these promises that are too good to be true.
Yes.
One promise that seems too good to be true is when someone says there is no possibility of loss.
Yes.
That sounds too good to be true. But then you follow it up by saying, because this bank that was ostensibly established by the United States of America is also backed and guaranteed by the United States of America, then you go, oh yeah, that makes sense. So there's no kind of like, I'm sure this was before FDIC was the thing, but it's kind of
way
like,
before.
Oh, we got FDIC. It's basically FDIC insured. So good. Let's throw our money in there. It'll be safe.
Yep. Just for the record, FDIC was founded in 1933.
There you go.
Quite a bit later.
A lot later.
Right.
Thanks, Great Depression.
You bet. So, beyond these questionable operational practices, there were some questionable related party transactions too. Your favorite and mine.
Right. Everyone's.
Yes.
Again, red flag. Absolutely.
For example, Henry D. Cook, one of the guys we mentioned earlier, who helped pressure Congress into changing the bank's charter to allow loans. His brother was J. Cook, the founder of J. Cook and Company, a prominent investment bank. Henry was also a partner at J. Cook and Company. Okay.
So he was on the board for Freedman's Bank, and
Correct.
He was a partner in this other bank.
He was a trustee, and he was a partner at J. Cook and Company.
Okay.
J. Cook and Company was notable because it helped underwrite the Union war effort. So that turned out fine for them.
Yeah.
It sold hundreds of millions of bonds during the war. J. Cook had a lot of influence in establishing the national banking system that came about in the 1860s, including a branch in Washington, D.C., and another in Philadelphia. And since Henry Cook was the head of the finance committee for the Freedmen's Bank, he decided to put a lot of Freedmen's Bank's deposits in the First Washington National Bank, where he was ostensibly the president.
Okay.
That bank paid Freedmen's Bank 5% interest on its deposits, while Freedmen's was paying its depositors 6%.
Which, for the uninitiated, that is unsustainable.
Yeah. Not good.
Where that other 1% just doesn't magically materialize.
Yeah. That is, that's bad banking.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's not all. After the bank charter was amended to allow loans, one of the loans made was for $50,000 to the Seneca Sandstone Company, which was owned by the Seneca Quarry. This loan was secured by the company's, quote, worthless bonds, end of quote, according to Osthouse's book. Who approved that loan? Henry Cook, who also was a board member of the quarry.
After the Civil War, J. Cook and Company invested heavily in railroads. Railroads back then were kind of in the same status as high-flying tech companies are nowadays. And in 1870, the Northern Pacific Railroad made Cook and Company its exclusive bond agent, but Cook and Company was shitty at being a bond agent and had trouble selling Northern Pacific Railroad's bond, and therefore wound up owning about 75% of those bonds that they had a hard time selling. To make matters only slightly worse, because that was already pretty bad, Cook also issued notes against its expected return on the sale of the Northern Pacific bonds. So it made loans based on their performance of selling bonds that they couldn't sell. And so therefore it's no surprise that they couldn't raise enough money to meet their obligations. As word got out about Cook's increasingly leveraged position, investors began pulling their money, as did Cook's depositors, which caused a run on their bank in September of 1873. And this in turn caused stock prices to drop, which in turn caused more bank runs and business failures, and hence the Panic of 1873 began. And everyone remembers the Panic of 1873, right? It was right after the Terror of 1872 and the pants shitting of 1874.
So we've got railroad projects failing left and right. And wouldn't you know it, Freedman's Bank had some exposure to that. In Professor Osthouse's book, he noted that Freedman's Bank invested in the bonds of the Union Pacific and Central Railroads via Henry and J. Cook and Company, of course, in violation of its charter as early as 1869. This exposure led to runs on some of the Freedman's branches in 1873. Following the panic, in an attempt to restore confidence in the bank among the African-American community, there was a significant change in the leadership of the bank. Freedman trustees replaced the founder and president, John Alvord, in March 1874 with Frederick Douglass. Yes, the Frederick Douglass. Douglass even invested $10,000 of his own money in the bank. But when Douglass discovered the true condition the bank was in, he quickly resigned, saying he, quote, was married to a corpse. In June 1874, he recommended that Congress shut down the bank. Freedman's Bank closed officially on July 2nd, 1874. In the process of winding the bank down, officials found that the actual value of its assets were far lower than what its books said. The report of the commissioners of the Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company reported that they amounted to less than 2% of the bank's total liabilities. That is bad.
So basically, if they collected all the money that was owed to them, they would have 2% of what they owed to everybody else.
I guess
that's beyond horrible banking.
Yeah,
I don't think that can be accounted for by lending your money at 5%. And
paying 5 and earning 6.
Yeah, yeah,
or earning 6 and
earning
paying
5 and paying 6. Yeah,
yeah.
We're bad bankers too.
Yeah, what it
is.
Not only are we not historians, we are not bankers.
Not bankers. Nope. Listen. That's amazing. It's amazing historical note that Frederick Douglass was was put in as the president of the Freedmen's Bank.
Yes.
But also the way the story reads, it sounds like he was bamboozled into taking that position.
He was. By all accounts that I saw, that is, he was misled into taking that job. Like, he knew that the bank was in some distress and he wanted it to succeed.
Okay.
But they hid a bunch of the problems from him.
Oh.
And so he took the job, I think, under false pretenses.
Awesome.
And so, yeah, just fantastic, right? And like, one of the things I read is a lot of the trustees wanted is they because they knew the bank was going to fail, they wanted a black person to be at the head of the bank so they could scapegoat them.
Oh, Jesus.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So we'll trick Frederick Douglass
Yeah.
into becoming the face of the bank.
Yeah.
So that when it fails, we can point at him for the failure of the bank.
Yeah. Yeah. But it didn't work. I mean, like, it's clear that he's like, he found out and he's like, no,
nope.
I quit. And by the way, shut it down. It's a lost cause. So
yeah.
pretty unsavory stuff.
Yeah.
Depositors suffered more than $3 million in losses. That's over 80 million in today's money. Depositors who received payouts got far less than they were owed. Small depositors, the majority of the more than 60,000 depositors at the time of the bank's failure, received little to no funds at all. As for any accountability for the bank's failure, there was none. A congressional investigation recommended that Henry Cook and others be indicted for their role in the failure of Freedmen's Bank, but no one was ever charged. In his book, Black Reconstruction in America, 1860 to 1880, W.E.B. Du Bois, the historian and civil rights activist, wrote, quote, "No more extraordinary and disreputable venture ever disgraced American business disguised as philanthropy than the Freedmen's Bank, a chapter in American history which most Americans naturally prefer to forget." Greg, Kyte, did we learn everything?
Yes,
we did. We learned a lot.
We did. No, this is yes, I learned tons because everything in this episode is brand new to me. I mean, the quote that you read from W.E.B. Du Bois, that Americans naturally prefer to forget. Yeah, they did, and so they never taught me about this. I feel
me neither.
I feel the same way about this story because I mean, again, that quote was the cherry on top of this story, where it was like it was disguised as philanthropy.
Yes,
but it ended up drastically hurting all the people that it was supposed to be assisting in this great time of need that they had.
Right.
And the fact that that's just been extracted from history is bizarre to me. And I feel the same way that because, and we talked about this briefly before we started recording, it feels the same way when I was watching Watchmen, the series on HBO. Yes. And that series starts with a reenactment of the Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre of Black Wall Street.
Yes.
And I was like, what is this fantastical story that they're inserting into American history? What the fuck? That actually happened?
Yep.
And I feel the same way. I felt weird then going, how did I not know about this? Why is this completely foreign to me? And I feel the same way about this story, where it's like, this is shocking that this isn't part of our education and part of just what we know as what happened, at least as people who spent a significant part of our advanced education learning about accounting and finance stuff. Why are we just learning about this now?
Yeah, I don't know. I will say that, this we discussed fraud in this episode because this is a show about frauds. It's not a history show. But in the aftermath of the Panic of 1873, things did not get better.
Right. Yeah, clearly.
for all the emancipated people, and not just those for the depositors of Freedmen's Bank, but all over the country. And I mean, this all came to a head. I mentioned, early in the show that during Reconstruction, there was a disputed presidential election. That was the presidential election of 1876. It was very, very close. It was disputed, as I said. It was one of the most contentious elections in American history. So if you think things are bad today, if you think things are bad, they have been bad before, very bad.
And we made it. Is that the inspirational message?
I don't know if it's inspirational or not, but I'm just saying,
either.
like,
hard to feel inspired by the story.
Here's just to tie this up. In the end, Rutherford B. Hayes, he's a Republican from Ohio. He defeated Samuel Tilden, a Democrat from New York. And it was because of this infamous political deal. It's known as the Compromise of 1877. And that is the only reason that Hayes became the president, because it gave him the presidency in exchange for the removal of federal troops in the southern states. Right?
Yeah, that's ringing a bell.
Yep.
Pretty sure I learned that one in my history class.
And this is what ended Reconstruction. So the Reconstruction era really was like what we talked about at the beginning. It was like it was trying to reunify the reunify the nation, rebuild its infrastructure, and address all of the impacts of slavery in American institutions, both in government but also in business, the social, political, and economic impacts. Right? That's what that was what Reconstruction was going to do. But because of this presidential election, because Rutherford B. Hayes wanted to be president, he's like, "You give me the presidency, we'll get out of your way, South.
Right. We'll get out of your hair.
We'll get out of your hay." And that was it. That ended Reconstruction. And so and it got bad. After that.
Things got bad after that.
There is a silver lining that was pointed out in a lot of the research I did. This silver lining was noted in a lot of places. The silver lining is that Freedmen's Bank is that the records of Freedmen's Bank are the largest single source of lineage-linked African-American records known to exist.
Okay.
More than 480,000 names, and those records have been indexed by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is because they do all that genealogy stuff there in your backyard, Greg. And so they indexed all that stuff. And so that is one of the silver linings, because a lot of, prior to that time, those kinds of records weren't kept.
Sure. Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
So in any case, anything else, Greg? Anything else that you learned?
I feel like we pointed out the fraud while we were telling the story.
Yeah.
Where it's the, it's the dealings with your bank where you're giving favorable terms to people and not doing your diligence in terms of your collateral for loans and again, like, even it wasn't just gross negligence. You can't get to where your assets are 2% of your liabilities just by negligence. You're intentionally screwing that. If you have any experience in any kind of banking, meaning do you have a checking account, then you could do a better job than having 2% of your liabilities covered by your assets.
What's pretty fascinating to me is that, like, I guess banking regulation as we understand it today didn't come for like 60 more years after that. Like the failure was in the 1870s, and like the Great Depression essentially started in 1929. Yeah. And like the Securities and Exchange Act was like 1933, 1934. And like that was at the same time when like the FDIC was established and like modern bank, like it took an almost 3/4 of a century for the government to get around saying, it's like, maybe we should put rules around these banks so people don't get screwed when they go out of business. So.
Right. Well, and another thing that comes to my mind from the story, just like a modern day echo of the Freedmen's Bank story, is when the PPP loans were going out. And all of that stuff was, the news was everyone's struggling with COVID. The government is making money available to you. They're through these PPP loans. Go to your bank, talk to your banker. They'll help. They'll get you they'll walk you through it and get you the money. And then the story that I remember coming out after that is that communities of color had a hard time accessing those funds.
Yes.
Because communities of color generally didn't have as strong of banking relationships.
Yeah, they were underbanked.
Underbanked. That was what it was called. And
Yep.
and then looking at this story as part of the history of people of color in this country, no shit.
Yeah,
They're underbanked. They got fucked hard.
Yeah.
The first time.
Yes.
That they got to have a banking relationship. Yeah. So maybe they're going to be, maybe banks aren't for us. That there's going to be echoes of that through your family where it's like, I don't put my money in a bank because I did that once.
Yep.
And it all just disappeared.
Yeah, and one of the other things I found in the research was there's scholarship around this precisely, that communities of color, because of the Freedmen's Bank failure, there were generations of distrust in banks because of that banking failure.
Yeah.
And so it's been established in the scholarship that this is why. And here we are 150 years later, and you talk about and it showed it of course it showed up in PPP loans and EIDL loans and all the rest, that the communities that needed it didn't get it because they didn't have banking relationships, or like you say, they were underbanked. Why were they underbanked? Well, you can probably trace it back to Freedmen's Bank.
You for sure can trace it back.
Yeah.
As has been well established, I am no historian, and I can connect those dots.
Yeah.
Pretty fucking easy.
Yeah.
Well, that's it for this episode. Remember to share this episode with anyone you know in Florida, because they won't learn about this stuff in their public education system.
And also remember, Abraham Lincoln hunted vampires, which is nice. But some of his other accomplishments were more important.
Much more important.
Much more important.
If you want to drop us a line, please do. Send us an email at ohmyfraud@earmarkcpe.com. And Caleb, if people want to reach out just directly to you, where can they do that?
They can find me on LinkedIn. Why do I even bother? I hate it when I can't even, I have nothing clever to say. LinkedIn / Caleb Newquist, or just a slash. LinkedIn. LinkedIn is the best place to find me. Greg, is LinkedIn a place where people can find you?
We've been telling people that for a lot of these episodes, and I haven't been on LinkedIn for probably 2 or 3 weeks now. So
good for you.
Likely there's a lot of DMs in there that people like going, you said I could get a hold of you here, and now where are you? I'm fine. Send me an email, greg@gregkyte.com. Really easy. I'm good with that.
Oh My Fraud is written by Greg Kyte and myself. Our producer is Zach Frank. Rate, review, and subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you listen on Earmark, you can earn CPE. It's a new year. Might as well get started.
It's seriously, why not?
Get some CPE.
Get the jump on that.
Get a jump on that shit. Join us next time for more avarice, swindlers, and scams from stories that will make you say, oh my fraud.
Oh my fraud.